So I want to welcome all that are joining now for this very interesting and fascinating final session of our conference today, Transformation Processes, Pathways to a Sustainable Future, that will be moderated by Marion Mehring from the Institute for Social Ecological Research. And I think it's absolutely fitting to her profile. What we want to do in this session is to understand the path and scale dependencies of different aspects of biodiversity at all scales. And we will have an overview on different trends in trade, in ethics, sorry, in success factors for transformation processes, and finally also in the aspect how to come toward positive futures for nature. We will have 4 different speakers from the UFZ in Leipzig in Germany, Yves Zinngrebe, supported by Christine Polzin, Stefan Knauß from the Martin Luther University, Markus Düwell from the Technical University of Darmstadt, and finally, and I hope on some concluding important words, Henrique Pereira from the National Institute for Integrative Biodiversity Research in Halle, Jena, Leipzig. I'm now overhanding to Marion, to you, and I'm looking forward to this wonderful session.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine, for this very nice introduction. And I would also like to welcome all of you back to this session, to this final session after the lunch break. And I think all of you enjoyed the session so far. I can say from my side, I enjoyed a lot. And as Christine said, I think with this session, we would now like to focus a bit more on the future, on transformation processes. And I'm really happy that we were successful to get 4 different dedicated experts on this topic. And yeah, with this, I would directly like to invite the first speaker, Yves Zinngrebe, and he will give a presentation on the topic of impacts and dependencies of trade on biodiversity, identifying knowledge needs. And Yves holds a PhD in biodiversity governance and is leading the working group on governance of biodiversity and nature conservation at UFZ, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig. And yeah, you are an expert, a long-term expert, I would say, in following the CBD processes and the COP conferences. You also led the accompanying scientific project to update the German biodiversity strategy. And you're also a coordinating lead author of the IPBES report on transformative change. Yeah, and with this, I would like to hand over to you, Yves, for your presentation. And I would also like to mention, as Yves has to leave a bit earlier, unfortunately, our session, your colleague, Christine Polzin, will represent you for the final discussion. So please, Yves, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this exciting event. And yeah, I love to discuss transformative change, and that's what I've been working on for the last 3 years in this assessment. That's also why I need to leave early. I need to catch a plane to Namibia to negotiate the report there. But now I'm excited to talk about a different project, and I will share my screen for that purpose. And yeah, as I've been very involved in the IPBES process, I just like to mention that I'm really grateful to my colleagues Christine Polzin and Yamini Yogia, who have really held my back on this front. And so this is response to the awareness that we found that trade and biodiversity is a heavily under-researched topic in its different facets that we've already heard a lot about during this event or during the other sessions. And what we've done is we've got together with other like-minded research institutes across Europe in this peer network that I'll introduce in a minute. And we have developed a structured process to identify knowledge gaps, and I want to illustrate these knowledge gaps with some research from our group. So you can see my screen just fine, right? Great. Yeah, what is the peer network? The peer network, as I said, is a network of research institutes on environmental issues across Europe. And we have the vision to establish an evidence base in support of policies and to collaboratively develop perspectives to these policies, which we in a way do more with a focus on research policy. And obviously, we hope that this will inspire funding processes further down the road. And peer is, or our peer collaboration doesn't only focus on this topic, but trade and regulation has been like a central element on this research agenda, connecting the protection and restoration, monitoring as the scientific efforts with this idea of securing biodiversity, obviously. One Health and planetary, the planetary health is another topic that another group is doing work on, but trade and regulation is what I'm going to present today. And the aim was to strengthen the science policy interface related to the impacts that the European trade has on biodiversity by creating this hub of expertise, co-develop the research agenda, identifying science service pathways, and bridging platforms, databases, and models. That's what we envision to do in the future. And yeah, so we had within our group started with a first agenda in 22. Then we have conducted a survey with experts, conduct information. In parallel, we conducted a literature review on these topics, have presented the first agenda, and then did some interviews to further line out the details, and have now developed this third version, had a workshop with policymakers in the EU to reflect on that, and now I'm presenting the final output. And these are the 5 subtopics that I'm going to dive in a second. Assessing impacts of trade on biodiversity, analyzing societal values and norms affecting ecological harmful trade, analyzing policies, regulation and trade agreements, and analyzing financial flows and supply chains, and developing knowledge data, tools, and networks. Well, that's our inductively developed groups to kind of categorize the different knowledge needs that we found. Obviously, it would be possible to categorize them in a different logic, but that is what made sense to us and made sense to all the people involved in this transdisciplinary process. So the first one, so on what needs to change, assessing impacts on trade and biodiversity. We know there's a lot of literature on direct approaches to, for example, assessing the biodiversity impacts of palm oil, or the direct impacts of that policy. But it's not that simple, because usually when we have interventions, then there's secondary effects, spillover effects. And this is a work led by Diana Ramirez Mejia that we work together on the potential effects, modeling what if we installed this 30 by 30 targets that would have secondary effects on moving other types of land uses. In this case, for example, on the right-hand side, you can see livestock in different areas where there's certain countries that would be rather displacers, so countries that have to move their needs for livestock production to other countries, whereas other countries such as Brazil, Western Africa would rather take on more of this production in this model. Another example is that when we look at Amazon, and Amazon is like the most important region for biodiversity globally, then we can see that land use is actually not made up by single commodities or single land uses, but of patterns. And in this project, this is a part of the PhD process by Diego Brizuela, who has found certain patterns that repeat themselves across the Amazon biome, and that find also the heavy interlinkages of certain commodities with their subnational contexts that, for example, have to do with the standing of agricultural and extractive industries within their governance systems, with internal migration, armed conflicts, and so on and so forth, which thereby widens actually the research needs and the indirect drivers that we need to take into account when we want to find possible solutions. And yeah, also the levels of commoditization vary with these contexts. And we're in the process of modeling how these frontiers are directly correlating to deforestation. So there's just two examples. In general, what we found as general knowledge gaps are geographic, taxonomic, and methodological biases towards certain foci. So that needs to be widened. We have interdisciplinary systems approaches, two drivers. I just showcased an example. There's a need to characterize and assess different externalities of trade, such as effects on transport, trade-induced changes, and local economic activities, and so on, and challenges in assessing both the extent and the distribution of costs and benefits. The next topic would be analyzing societal values and norms affecting ecological harmful trade. That's also from Diego's work, where we looked at the distribution of palm oil in Peru in two political regions, San Martin and Ucayali, and they have different dynamics. And I can't explain the whole thing, obviously, but I wanted to flag that we found that the bottleneck, so the most important investor in Peru, or investment group, so to say, Alicorp, and actually adopted a voluntary commitment to no deforestation as a response to this emerging global regulations, because they found it's creating bad press, and it's not in their idea in line with their business strategy. So that's just an interesting effect that I found to where regulations can have indirect effects, and you only find them when you actually look into the production system. So widening out again the general knowledge gaps that we found for this topic is a need to look at the links between economic growth, resource use, and biodiversity, the effects of power imbalances and inequity on resource use, the disconnection between production and consumption environment and actors. So there's different perceptions in the production system and the consumption system. They can interact, and that's important to understand if we want to find solutions. And the topic of institutional weaknesses, links to non-compliance, illegal activities, property rights, and so on. Next topic is analyzing policies, regulation, and trade agreements as possible solutions. And I picked that research from a project on trees on farms that was financed by ICI in 4 tropical developing countries on harnessing the potential of trees on farms for meeting global biodiversity targets. And there we looked at actor networks that governed the use of trees as central habitat structures in agricultural landscapes in these countries. And we found that there's actually a strong social capital among actors that are involved in the governance. They are just oriented towards intensification and not towards sustainability. But there were important roles, and that's why I'm presenting this here. There was an important role of non-state actors, such as international banks, international carbon credits and transnational businesses that actually also introduce the idea of either tree structures within the farming areas, or creating forests as a compensation scheme as a response to or for the payment of carbon credit, and so on and so forth. And again, this is to highlight that there's a need to look at the production system, and there's not necessarily a one-fits-all solution on the in the consumption system or on the global level. Yeah, this is just like the methodology on the left-hand side that we use to identify these incentives, and that pointed us also to these international influences as part of the overall governance system. The general knowledge gaps are multilateral agreements on biodiversity and biodiversity-related trade, so they need to be looked at together. Union bilateral trade policy agreements, biodiversity and invasive species regulations, and policy coherence, also in the sense that I just presented, looking at the coherence of or the interplay between consumption-based policies and production-based policies. Analyzing financial flows and supply chains. This is an example of, like here, we analyze the overall cropland imports into the EU and looked at them in terms of monetary values, in terms of ecological footprint and imported deforestation. And surprisingly, we found that some countries are more important than others in terms of relevance, which means the relevance it has for the overall impact that the EU consumption has in the rest of the world, and leverage in the sense that the share of the producing country that is exported into the EU, assuming that the higher the leverage value is, the higher is the influence of the EU in that country. And we found that there's very important trading partners, and that can be grouped and could potentially be included, or where sustainability safeguards can be focusing on. And also national biodiversity strategies could identify the potential impacts that we have on consumptions that then have a secondary effect abroad, and looking at the national biodiversity strategies, that is currently not happening. And I'm getting closer to my time limit, so I'm trying to be shorter on the last one, but just to sum up, general knowledge gaps in that area are financial sector stability and nature-related risks, corporate reporting and disclosure of nature-related risks, and redirecting financial flows from harmful to enhancing activities for biodiversity. And as I flagged several times, that has to be looked on in an interplay between producing and consuming countries, and also certain commodities might be more important for that. As we can see on the left-hand side, that it's actually 4 products that make up 81% of the EU's imported deforestation. So I'm jumping over the last one, which basically says that business reporting is a very important lever that is developing, and we might want to produce the scientific knowledge necessary to inform these processes. So we have a stake in producing, in defining what is actually measured when we look at biodiversity or sustainability in business reporting. And yeah, so private sector data informing these different tools that are emerging. And yeah, I'll leave it there. And just to conclude, saying analyzing trade has more diverse research implications, especially when looking at the underlying causes related to transformative change. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Yves, for your presentation and sharing your insights from the peer network group. And I think we have time for one question. There was one question directly related to your presentation, and it says that sustainable food chains are a request of international relevance to feed to grow the growing world population. And how will trade regulations potentially be risky for generating more hunger and pressures in the global south?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we have this quantity challenge, right? That issue that we have a limited space globally, and we need to be careful what we use this space for. And knowing that the EU is importing half of its biocapacity from other places also gives us the responsibility to look exactly on what we're looking. That is the argument that we have with relevance in that paper that I just presented. At the same time, there's a growing global population, and there's in some commodity chains the risk of, if the EU simply phases out, then other players take over and don't necessarily manage the land more sustainably. For example, in the case of palm oil in East Asia, where the EU was a bit rapid in establishing certain safeguards, and then markets are increasingly taken over by India and China, and the sustainability safeguards gain less importance. What I wanted to say is that we have a global responsibility, and in that collective dilemma, we need to find global solution as best as we can. We've seen the limitations to that in CBD and UNFCCC negotiations. And maybe there's groups of the willing to bring that forward. I think certain trade agreements, like with Mercosur, have a lot of power in adding to that. But yeah, it's challenging.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Yves. And I think in the final discussion, we will probably come back to the question on the role of policies and how to adapt, refine, implement, etc. Thanks a lot for the presentation. And yeah, then I would directly like to welcome the next speaker. And this is Stefan Knauß from the Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. And Stefan studied political science, media, and communication, and he received his doctorate in philosophy, and he is now working as a research associate for sustainable landscape development at the Institute of Geoscience and Geography at the Martin Luther University and at the Department of Conservation Research at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research. And Stefan was also part of the German biodiversity assessment that you can see here, Faktencheck Artenvielfalt, in the chapter Transformation Potentials. And yeah, Stefan, the floor is yours for your presentation. What can we learn from successful transformation processes?
Yeah, hello everyone from my side. I'm very honored to present as a part of the Faktencheck Artenvielfalt team, and especially as a lead author of the Transformative Potential a chapter. As you know, more than 117 authors has been involved in this massive work, and I'm just a small part of it, but nevertheless, I will present you what we actually did in this exciting report. So a few slides to introduce the whole Faktencheck. We basically applied the IPBES questions to Germany and wanted to know how is biodiversity changing in Germany, what are the consequences for our ecosystems and the services they provide for us, what are the direct causes of change on the ground. And also, to come more to the human sphere, what are the driving forces behind the biodiversity loss, and what can we do to promote biodiversity and to reverse the trend of its loss. And finally, the question directly of our chapter, how can we get people on board for this big project of the socio-ecological transformation? So these are the chapters that are particularly interesting for social scientists and philosophers like me. You might have heard about the key findings. Just to repeat them: 60% of the habitats in Germany are in an inadequate or even poor conservation status. 40% of the biotope types have a negative development, and 1/3 of the species are actually endangered in Germany. These negative trends mostly apply in agriculture and open land habitats, and they have to do with species-rich groups. We asked several instruments to promote biodiversity, and this figure here shows 3 different types of measures. First, the changes in management, the area protection, and impulses and measures, such as the construction of a fish ladder or the introduction of species in a certain habitat. The habitat groups named the most important measures for each type and ranked them in order of the importance. You see the darkest color is for management here. This means actually that our chapter colleagues found that for biodiversity in the 4 habitats, agriculture and open land, aquatic habitats and soil, the extensification of agriculture is the most important measure. But overall, we have to say that all the measures must be combined to maximize a positive impact on biodiversity. But agriculture is really important here. In terms of indirect drivers, political legal drivers are very significant. Environmental policy has a positive effect, but suffers greatly from implementation deficits and competition with opposing policies. The common agriculture policy is seen as kind of neutral or even slightly positive after its current reform. Energy policy, especially in relation to bioenergy production, has a negative impact on biodiversity. In terms of economic and technological drivers, modern technologies are generally seen as positive. Increased economic trends tend to have negative effects due to the increased resource consumption and transport infrastructure. Currently, the sealed area in Germany is larger than the area of nature conservation. Positive social drivers are education, recent changes in consumption, for example, eating less meat, and of course, the participation in climate demonstration and other initiatives. Crises such as COVID and the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine not only, in fact, have an impact on the political system, but also a negative impact on biodiversity. But this is the key question maybe for the social science and humanities scholars dealing with the topic of biodiversity. With the results of the indirect drivers, we have indications where political regulations can be applied and how knowledge and awareness of biodiversity can be strengthened. But knowledge alone does not generate any commitment. Transformation is therefore ultimately about acting in a more biodiversity friendly way, especially in economy. So the first take-home message here is that satisfying human needs with significantly fewer resources is an important goal for the transformation. Creating products with less or tendentially no external costs for the environment and the society seems to be inevitable for this shift. Finally, mainstreaming this alternative view on development by making it attractive for political majorities is absolutely necessary, and I think that's the only way in a democratically governed society. To this end, we analyzed examples of historical change processes that had a positive impact on biodiversity, such as the stepping stone concept in the Steigerwald, the Amscher conversion, or the Waddensee National Park. We analyzed various parameters for the vision, the knowledge, the action, and the dynamics of these change processes. The results shows clearly there is not the one thing that makes a difference, but rather a variety of different approaches that are needed to achieve a turnaround for biodiversity protection. So this is our second take-home message here. There is not a silver bullet for doing transformation. There's not the one measurement that you can take and you make it sure, but rather a combination of things. But of course, we know what helps, and this is a selection of things that we identified. We need a representative monitoring of biodiversity that also includes the direct drivers, and we also need monitoring of indirect drivers. Company reports can help here in a similar way that also Yves pointed out. Agriculture has an important role, so it needs to explore new and more lucrative avenues. It must earn money with biodiversity and not against it. So taking away certain fertilizers and chemicals can help here, and stopping subsidies that are actually harmful for biodiversity would be the way to go. Thirdly, we know rather well which measures and instruments can be used to promote biodiversity, but the implementation gap is a big problem. So from the standpoint of the authors, we say that the German speed for the protection of our livelihood in the sense of the CBD would be a good thing. But yeah, seen from today, the German speed is has not been established in other parts of the policy, and not to talk about biodiversity. Another thing that seems important to us is that we need to pick the people up where they are and let them actually try things out, first in laboratories and then on a larger scale. Finally, we need to develop a sustainable, attractive lifestyle together and promote it politically. At the same time, we need to reduce the subsidies that are harmful for nature. Overall, our analysis have shown that it's important to rethink biodiversity conservation with a view to a socio-ecological transformation and to move away from the conservation versus use dichotomy. Nature conservation should no longer be understood as the opposite of nature utilization. Despite of this optimism to combine sustainability with an idea of prosperity, we nevertheless see in the policies of today that the old paradigm of economy versus ecology is played very hard, especially by populist parties. And nevertheless, the Nature for Future framework that I guess Henrique Pereira in the end will talk about more intensive will help us here. It combines different motives and justifications for biodiversity conservation. And here the take-home message would be not only the nature for nature dimension is helpful for protecting biodiversity, but also nature for society and nature as culture is an important contribution. To finish with a positive note and vision, I like to quote Walt Disney: if you can dream it, you can do it as well. Well, it's partly the American dream, but at least it shows that we have to create visions for the future, and imagine the pathways that we can take all together. And this will be my last slide. So what characterized all the successful change examples that we analyzed can be summarized in 3 bullet points here. So firstly, the joint development of vision for the future, because the case studies have shown that biodiversity conservation does not always have to be an exclusive and sole objective. However, it was always helpful in the examples that we analyzed to think about the future of social change in a spatially large and integrative way, even at an early stage. As a society, we have to have an idea what kind of nature we want to live in, and to think about this in small groups and publicly will be very helpful for this process. We have heard that knowledge and awareness of biodiversity has increased, but our analysis has shown that there is a lack of knowledge for action, a kind of practical knowledge, how this change can succeed. So we can summarize that change needs to be tried out. New experimental spaces are needed to try out biodiversity-friendly practices. This is where environmental education can contribute and develop new formats to create such spaces. And finally, biodiversity conservation needs to be made more binding. This applies both to the individual action, such as establishing sustainable lifestyles on a personal level, as well as setting a political framework accordingly and consistently implementing the goals, for example, of the CBD across all the sectors of our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for presenting the German assessment of biodiversity. It was a huge 3 years project, and I know it's not an easy task to summarize it in 15 minutes, but thanks a lot for doing this and for keeping the time. There is one direct question related to your presentation, and I will allow this before I hand over to the next speaker. And this question is on the indirect drivers. Are indirect drivers not an expression of local values that have to be taken for granted? Why should these worldviews be changed?
That's a tough question. We have a lot of political debate about changing the values and the worldview of people. And especially in the last years, we always say, well, no one has the right to change the way I think and I want to live. Yeah, that's one thing that we have to take in account. But if we summarize all the individual lifestyles and see the hazardous effects of this lifestyle, as a society, we need to take action. And we are able to take action if it comes to harmful behavior for the society and social cases. And why not for nature as well? And what we are proposing here is not a directive top-to-down action, although we always have this idea, well, it would be good to have policy trickling down from the global level to Europe, to the national level, whatever. But especially in the transformative potential, we're talking about opening spaces for discussion that can take into account also local solutions and local values.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you very much, Stefan. And we will have time in the final discussion also maybe to go a bit more deeper into this discussion. But now I would like to introduce the next speaker, and this is Markus Düwell. He is from the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany, and Markus is a moral philosopher and currently teaching philosophy at the Technical University of Darmstadt, and his research interests include the foundational questions of moral and political philosophy, philosophical anthropology, bioethics, environmental, as well as climate ethics. And the title of your talk today is Why and How to Care About the Future Towards an Ethics of Biodiversity Policy. Welcome to the session, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot. As you've heard, I'm just a philosopher, not a practitioner. And what I will do is to outline some fundamental challenges from which I think that they are important for biodiversity policies. They have mainly to do with questions of long-termism. And I rely here on considerations that have been discussed within a bigger international and interdisciplinary consortium, Rights to a Green Future, which I was directing for some years, and they resulted in some publications that you can find on my website. The topics I will address are not new, but I think still unsolved. And among the publications that are relevant here, I just want to mention the important publications of Herwig Unnerstahl, since he is attending this conference. So it seems to be broadly accepted that we should support the restoration of biodiversity. Also, the political consequences from this consensus are limited. The main reasons for such duties are, on the one hand, the importance of our own relationship to nature, and on the other hand, duties regarding future people. The situation of future people will be desperate if various capacities of ecosystems will not be enhanced. The normative consensus is, for example, emphasized by the recent IPBES report, where we can read, relational values refer to the meaningfulness of people-nature interactions and interactions among people, including across generations through nature. As a philosopher, I must confess that the term relational values raises a lot of questions. And to be honest, I don't think the term is well chosen. But for the sake of this talk, we can take the term relational value as an articulations for the duties just described. So leaving the terminology aside, the commitment to restoration faces some challenges. Some of those challenges are straightforward, the lack of economic and political power to enforce them. But even if everybody would take these commitments serious, there are some obstacles within our moral and legal frameworks. Thus, I assume that there is a very fundamental normative conflict. Let me try to explain this. Restoring biodiversity may conflict with some rights, liberties, and interests of contemporary citizens. And protecting nature may conflict in some cases with other policy goals, including defeating climate change, enhancing economic growth, supporting poorer countries in their attempt to mitigate climate change. Of course, some will now reply, on the long run, mitigation of climate change is only possible if the dramatic loss of biodiversity will be stopped, and the other way around. Restoring biodiversity will enhance quality of life, and it's important for some economic goals. All of that is correct. But it cannot be taken for granted that those goals can be realized harmoniously, particularly since the direct interest of at least some contemporaries may be different from those living in the future. And if there are conflicts, restoration of biodiversity will very often not have priority. The fundamental obstacle is that most of our regulations are fundamentally biased. They tend to ignore the future in favor of the present. The fundamental normative conflict is that our normative frameworks have a short-termist and not a long-termist bias. If rights current people are at stake, then normally we prevail over the protection of those goods that future people will need to realize their goals and to lead their life. Future people cannot vote, and they are not fully represented in the political and legal order, even if some recent lawsuits try to make a difference. Of course, younger people will be affected in their options in later life, and they can vote, but even the younger of them are not fully represented in the political order. In any case, this bias is obvious. It may be, however, the reason for this bias is not only a result of unwillingness of the contemporaries. Perhaps we just lack a convincing plan how a long-termist normative framework would look like. Thus, we should take it as a serious task to figure this out. Let me briefly sketch the task we are facing here. So why, so the dominant post-World War II normative framework is built on the idea of dignity and rights of all human beings. The fundamental normative institutions like democracy, rule of law, international human rights institutions, all of that depend in their plausibility on the normative starting points of human dignity and human rights. There are some debates whether the starting points are themselves a result of Western colonialism, which I cannot address here, but I assume at least that a consistent criticism of colonialism and racism will have to rely for the justification on these normative starting points as well. If that were correct, and we can of course discuss it, the fundamental challenge would be to think the framework of human dignity and human rights in an intergenerational perspective. The question is it possible to see future people as part of this normative framework of human dignity and human rights? I mean, not only think it rhetorically, but can we figure out how the rights, the regulations, the procedures, the institutions would look like that would seriously integrate these intergenerational perspectives? And if that were the case, it would have strong implications for the protection of the ecological conditions on which future people will rely. But the challenge is bigger than one may expect. It's not just a question of adding some provisions to the human rights regulations like future human beings have the same rights as his contemporaries. Future people are not citizens of a specific country. We don't even know which countries will exist in the future. We do not know how many people will exist in the future. But if we would think of political representation of future people, their number would outweigh that of the contemporaries. We do not know which technologies will be available, etc. In many cases, we cannot causally reconstruct how the actions of specific companies today will influence the life conditions of specific agents in the future. All of that make it very difficult to hold specific agents today responsible and to forbid them specific actions. Of course, one can claim that we know enough to understand that current actions will do some harm in the future, but going that route would require an extensive use of the precautionary reasoning, which have downsides. Because if you restrict some actions due to precautionary reasons, you cannot pinpoint how the specific, so restricted actions are directly harming others. And the rights framework requires, perhaps, or at least in the dominant understanding, that we justify a restriction of the exercise of liberties by harm of others. An extensive use of precautionary reasoning will inevitably be experienced as arbitrary by some people. And there are reasons why all the environmental policies and their lack of systematic integration in the current framework are picked up by the populist movements who exploit those tensions for their destructive agenda. So I don't mention all these problems because I think we should forget about long-termism, but I think we should take these challenges serious in order to be able to overcome them. The starting point should be to face the problem that on the one hand, we have committed ourselves to long-termist goals in international agreements, but on the other hand, we have insufficient tools to deal with the implications of these commitments within the political and legal order. And here are some points that we would have to discuss from my point of view. First, our lifestyle caused interventions in nature that are so far-reaching that the scope of our responsibility has been fundamentally changed. By directly influencing the life conditions of future people in that way, we have an unprecedented responsibility. This creates a social relationship between the contemporaries and the future, which is not reflected in the dominant moral convictions and legal frameworks. Thus, we first would have to ask how this link be reflected. And as a legal framework, we could think, of course, about representations of future generations in parliamentary and governmental structures. There are some discussions about that, but the results are not very significant. So the German Ethics Council, for example, in its recent statement on climate justice, does not even engage in the debate at all. So whatever you think about it, I mean, that should be discussed. And one can think about options to reshape the constitutional order for the sake of future people. But that would result in restrictions of liberties to contemporaries. And to some extent, that is unavoidable if you want to restore biodiversity. But this would only be a restrictions that would not only be a restriction in the exercise of liberties, but it would as well change the political order and the political culture. If you understand politics as a struggle between ideas, policy proposals and ideologies, it seems that the scope of ideologies that may participate in the political contestation would be extremely restricted. And I guess the populist movements are to some extent related to the feeling of this restriction. So they have the feeling they are not part of the political contestation. The contestation, however, is a central element of politics in general and for politics in open societies in particular. Thus, we should ask, how is it possible to inscribe the duty for intergenerational responsibility in the constitutional order without destroying the dynamics of political contestation? This would at least require that the political culture would disentangle the intergenerational responsibility from specific ideological commitments. That means conservative Christianity, economic liberalism, left-wing visions, all of them should find their way to engage with intergenerational commitments. This should be possible in general, since each of these political visions rely on ecological conditions for their realization in the future. And fourth, inscribing intergenerational commitments in the national and international political order is not possible without effects on the structure of the institution. I know we cannot wait for constitutional change before we work towards nature protection, but I would expect that one is aware of the disparity between existing institutions and the long-termist policy goals. And if not, it is not impossible to think about long-termist institutions. One example would be the Dutch water institution that has been established centuries ago. Since the Netherlands are very vulnerable with regard to the sea, those institutions had the task to ensure the water policy for the next 100 years. This was established due to the awareness that everything else is pointless if the dikes will not function. And this policy was accepted by Catholics, Calvinists, socialists, atheists, you name it. Thus, it's not unthinkable to have long-termist institutions, and it's worthwhile to investigate their possibility. So I'm aware that this is only a rough outline of an agenda for the discussion about intergenerational responsibility. And I'm aware I mentioned fundamental challenges here. My goal is not to be the philosophical troublemaker that frustrate practitioners, but if one is not aware how much populism is related to the resistance against ecological goals, we should face all these challenges. Otherwise, Donald Trump will remind us that they exist. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Markus, for your presentation on this definitely very important topic. And there is one question in the chat that is directly related to the beginning of your presentation, and maybe you can give a short answer to this. The question is, I would be interested to hear a bit more about your critique on the term relational values in its interplay with instrumental and intrinsic values, and why you choose them from the IPBES report as a starting point for your argument, and not, for example, the broad values that underpin the specific values in the IPBES values assessment framework.
I just referred to relational value because it's part of this bigger discussion. So if one would go more in detail here, there would a bigger discussion would be necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a bit of problem that, first of all, I think values are in general relational. In my understanding, there are not non-relational values. Every values refer to valuing beings. So is someone who values something. And that makes the term difficult, but that is more a general philosophical problem. But the underlying problem is that it does not really lay out where the problem, it's not clear what you say if you say relational values. You would have to explain how this could provide philosophical answer to the problems I just described. And this, I cannot see that there is so far a philosophical explanation of this entire concept that would really give us a sufficient account of that. Mm-hmm. So I would be interested in discussion with people who would mm-hmm. defend the concept, but I would think we should think about more broader discussion. And mm-hmm. to start with values in a political realm is a complicated story. So mm-hmm. there are reasons why we start with dignity and rights in the German constitution and not with values. Mm-hmm. So but that's a bigger philosophical story. Mm-hmm. And
okay. Thank you, Markus. So you invite those participants who are interested for a further and deeper discussion are now invited to contact Markus directly. Thanks a lot, Markus. And with this, I would like to invite the final speaker of our session, and this is Henrique Pereira. And he will give a presentation with the very promising title, Towards a Positive Future for Nature and People. And Henrique Pereira is professor for biodiversity conservation at IDIF. This is the German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research at the Martin Luther University, also in Halle-Wittenberg. And he is an expert on biodiversity change and science policy, and he worked both as a researcher and as a practitioner, having served as a director of Peneda Gerês National Park and as a coordinator of the Portugal Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And Henrique was also part of the IPBES expert group on scenarios and models. And with your presentation, you will give us some insights, hopefully how a positive future could look like. Henrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will not solve the intergenerational issues that Markus mentioned, and I really enjoyed this talk because it sets up a lot of the challenges that we have to solve in terms of the democratic decision making that we need to address, and I think many of the things could relate also to climate change challenges. It will be the same kind of issues as the biodiversity change challenges. But what I'll talk about is what kind of tools we have to examine these policy options and these future options, leaving out a bit how we can make them democratically possible. And so more an examination of those options. And I'd like to start about these international targets that we've been having since the convention was signed. Convention on Biodiversity was signed in 1992. We've had every 10 years a set of targets with the goal of addressing the biodiversity crisis, different levels of ambition. And now more recently, we have the post-2020 Kunming-Montreal framework with several goals and several targets. And always the idea is to address the biodiversity crisis, either stop biodiversity loss or reduce biodiversity loss or reverse biodiversity loss in the different components of biodiversity, from genetic ecosystem level to the benefits we derive from biodiversity. And one way of examining these policies, and until now, we have not been doing a very good job because the problems don't seem to be improved very much, although some issues have been addressed over the last 30 years. But one tool to do this is are scenarios. So scenarios are representations of possible futures for biodiversity, ecosystem services for people, for societies, and there can be ways of addressing relationship between nature benefits to people, and the good quality of life. And in 2016, this was one of the first assessments of IPBES, was to look at what scenarios we had there to support policy making regarding to biodiversity. And in this report, the conclusion was that there was no single set of scenarios that would address all the spatial and temporal scales that the policy making on biodiversity needed, and that link these drivers, the different drivers of policy interventions operating at different scales. And therefore, the recommendation to the IPBES was plenary was that it should work with the wider scientific community to develop a flexible and adaptable suite of multi-scale scenarios. And I had the honor of leading this effort with the creation of the expert group on scenarios and models. We had our first meeting here in Leipzig, in IDIF, in 2017 to start this process. And at that time, we decided we'll have two paths to do this. First path that we called BESIM, now BESIM 1, was to use the classic approach of doing these scenarios modeling in time for the first global assessment. That meant that we needed to do this in a little over 2 years. And that approach is you start with some socioeconomic or climate scenarios that were out there. We use the SSPs, RCPs scenarios, shared socioeconomic pathways, relative concentration pathway scenarios. We had trajectories for those drivers. There were some land use projections and climate projections based on those drivers. And we start with land use projections, climate projections, feed them into biodiversity ecosystem services models and see what happens to biodiversity ecosystem services. And in my first part of my presentation, I'll show some of the results of that exercise. And the second path was to develop a different set of scenarios that put nature values at the center of policy making that we call nature feature scenarios. And the idea was more to have a socio-ecological coupling where we don't see nature as an end recipient of humans' actions, but we see these relationships between people and nature. And the hope is that we will have them in time for the second global assessment. That means by 2028. So we did these two pathways we started both pathways around 2018, but at a different pace. with a very fast for the pathway one. And there we combined, as I said, land use and climate projections with a bunch of biodiversity models and a bunch of ecosystem services models to produce a harmonized analysis of the future of biodiversity. And these are some of the results. We just published them. Most of the work was done by 2020, but some refinement was done over the last few years, and we just published them in Science earlier this year. And what we have here in the left and in the right is impacts considering only land use change on biodiversity, and on the right, impacts considering land use change and climate change. And we have different metrics that we looked like: global species richness, global extinctions, to local species richness, to biodiversity intactness. These are different metrics of biodiversity because biodiversity is multidimensional. You need to look at different metrics across different spatial scales. And we compare the historical scenario, this is 1900 to 2015, to future scenarios that are 2015 to 2050. And we look at three scenarios. One is global sustainability. This is more a scenario where a set of environmental policies are put into place. Regional rivalry, where there is more emphasis on, let's say, a Trump world, more each one by itself and trying to focus on their own economies. And the third one, it is more globalized, but based on fossil fuels. And we have different model projections. I just wanted to highlight two main results here from this analysis that are the following. First, that if you look at land use change, it is not likely that even in the worst scenario, we'll have the same level of biodiversity loss in the next few decades as we had in the 20th century. The 20th century was truly exceptional. We more than doubled the population size in the planet, the human population size. And this is hopefully not going to be repeated in the next century. There's no projection that says that it will be 16 billion by 2050, and even later in the century, not likely to reach those population sizes. And so, from a point of view of land use demands, it's not likely that we'll have this kind of impact. But there is some more positive scenarios, like global sustainability in relation to fossil fuel development or regional rivalry. So there's ways of having policies that will reduce the impacts of land use to almost zero, or even reversing from the point of view of biodiversity intactness. In the case of global sustainability, so we can, depending on the set of policies we enact and set of societal changes we enact, we can be in a better situation or a worse situation, but not likely to be as bad as the last century in any case. But this is only like land use change, because when you consider climate change, then the picture becomes a bit more complicated. And if you consider together land use change and climate change, then we're probably going to have a bigger problem this century than we had in the last century. And so across all the scenarios, even in the most positive scenario, we are seeing more losses of biodiversity, significantly more losses of biodiversity across different metrics than in the last century. We can look at this spatially, historical patterns, at the future patterns in the different regions. The middle row is just with land use, the last row is with climate change also. And we also look at the consequences for ecosystem services. And this is also interesting to look at, to understand what happened in the past century and what is happening this century. So what happened in the past century is that if you look at material ecosystem services, this was a story of success. You can see this in the story of success, because in the 1960s, in the beginning of the environmental science movement, a lot of scientists and people were complaining or were concerned that we'll not be able to feed the population, because the population was growing much faster than the food production. But in reality, what we did was we did kind of a miracle, where the Green Revolution allowed us to increase the food production at rates of around 15% per decade, and the timber production at similar rates, what means that we more than we almost increased by 300% food and feed during the past century. So this is extraordinary. It was an extraordinary achievement that we have in the last century, but with costs to our the quality of water, freshwater quality, with costs to the soil, with costs to the capacity of ecosystems to, for instance, protect us from disturbances. And so there was an increase in material ecosystem services at the cost overall of regular ecosystem services. What the scenarios tell us for the future is that these increases in ecosystem services are now slowing down in material ecosystem services. Particularly in the global sustainability, we are able to put a hold on population growth. And if we have the right set of policies, we can even enhance some ecosystem services in relation to what we have now. So there's some good news, but the risk of going also in scenarios with further deterioration of ecosystem services is out there. Okay, but these scenarios are still not considering all the possibilities that we have for improving the futures of people and nature. Only consider a very limited set of policies regarding that, and mainly don't also incorporate socio-ecological feedbacks very well. So we have started developing these nature future scenarios. Stefan mentioned them already. And we started with some visioning about what could be visions with stakeholders for positive futures. And this visioning process was mostly concluded by, and the development of the Nature Futures Framework was mostly concluded by 2020. In the last couple of years, we've been doing some more further consultation, and now we're starting to do the modeling of these visions across scales, systems, and regions. And the visions, we started with these visions that what could be, how it would look like a positive future for nature. And these visions are different for different stakeholders. And that led us to this idea that you need to look at different types of values and different types of perspectives to understand what could be positive futures for nature. And we identify three main perspectives: the nature for nature perspective, it is kind of an intrinsic value approach, nature for itself, the nature for society that emphasizes the ecosystem services and the benefit we obtain from nature for people, and the nature as culture, that is this perspective that we cannot separate nature and people. People and nature are just one, like the cultural landscape perspective. And this is important to, as I emphasize again, that we need to really go towards democratic decision-making for this kind of issues. We cannot, it's not about just this, the majority opinion, is also not about the different minority opinions. We need to look at this, at what kind of mechanisms we can have to look at different preferences, different nature futures, and how to enact policy and approve policies with societal support. And I think that the previous speaker mentioned several challenges that we have in doing this. Anyway, we started looking at Nature Futures Framework. We look we have looked at how past studies of at local level, for instance, in Europe, of scenarios for land use change can be classified along the Nature Futures Framework. And what we identify is that depending on the type of scenario, these are scenarios that were not developed with Nature Futures Framework, but was kind of reclassified. But depending on the type of scenario, you get a different bundle of benefits across different types of ecosystem services. And I think it's important to know that if you ask a group of people, you may want a given bundle of ecosystem services, another one, you may want another bundle. We have also looked at how you could do this for cities, how you could redesign cities according to these different nature futures. How do you how this could affect the future land use in Europe. This is some analysis done by Peter Verberg's team in how you, for instance, reach the 2030 goals according to different perspectives or different nature futures. So there is not a single way of reaching the 2030 biodiversity strategy goals in Europe. And now we're starting this modeling exercise. We just brought together a major consortium to do this, and that have integrated assessment models, biodiversity system services models, and sociological models. And we're looking at this at different time scales and different regions in this consortium that we brought together from partners all over the world. Just had the first workshop recently. And so I hope that we'll have this result in time in 2 years for the next IPBES global assessment. So take-home messages. Biodiversity is likely to continue to decline during this century, although there are policy scenarios in which the decline can be substantially reduced or even reversed for some metrics if you consider only land use change. There is not a single preferred future for nature and people. Different stakeholders have different preferences for how to protect nature and ecosystem services. And the Nature Futures framework allows us to explore those preferences and define policies that improve multiple dimensions of biodiversity in a pluralistic and transformative approach. And the set of multi-scale nature future scenarios that looks at these approaches is now being developed by Bastian too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrique, for the presentation and introducing your work as part of IPBES and also the Nature's Futures frameworks. As time is running, I would like to suggest there is one question directly related to you, Henrique, to the reference time of 1900 in the chat. Maybe you can answer this question directly in the chat later. And I would now like to invite all the speakers to a final joint plenary session, Stefan, Markus, Henrique, and Christine for representing Yves. And I think we have maybe, so I would say 10 minutes for a joint final discussion. And as far as I can see, most of the questions that were raised in the chat are more or less already answered. And I just can see a message from Yves that you will join via your mobile phone and can answer questions directly, if I understood correctly. So going through the questions in the chat and while reflecting a little bit on your presentations, we heard a lot of different perspectives on the topic of transformation, future pathways. We talked about the different policies, potential side effects. We heard about also the topic of intergenerational justice. And maybe my final question to all of you, to the four of you, would be, against the background of your presentations and your expertise, what would you say when we think about transformative change or transformation pathways for the future? Do you think we are, let's say we have already the right policies, the right institutional settings, the right instruments, and it's just a question to better implement, to better outreach, or to better mainstream them? Or do you think, against the background of your presentations, that we kindly need a paradigm shift in future conservation and maybe towards more social ecological transformation? And how would or should this look like? So this would be a question to all of you, the four of you. And who would like to start and share your thoughts on this? Stefan? You're unmuted.
Well, let's give it a try. On the one hand, we see that biodiversity targets, sustainability targets are not reached over decades. Henrique said this. So it looks like the institutions, the values, the governance systems that we have are not able to effectively reach sustainability goals that scientifically seem to be absolutely necessary to reach. So this justifies almost this urge for a transformative change, the idea that we need to come up with something fundamentally new because obviously the institutions we have don't fulfill the needs that we think that are necessary to solve. On the other hand, with the remarks of Markus and others in the chat, it's dangerous to dismantle the architecture of rights and governance that we have, and it's a difficult task. So I think step by step transforming the institutions we already have, measuring them towards the goals that we agreed upon in other political fora is a kind of way in the middle, and I'm afraid we will have to take this, lose some of the biodiversity and cause some even worse climate disaster, but going slowly with the democratic systems that we have.
Thank you, Stefan. What about the others? Markus, yeah?
Yeah, perhaps one point in addition. I mean, I said already that I think some institutional changes are necessary, but I mean, if one think about the election in the US, so most of us will be a bit desperate when it comes to the realization. So what's realistic at the moment? Yeah, and so there is not. We don't have times of optimism at the moment. I think we all agree about that. But on the other hand, you never know what will happen in the future and whether there will be moments where we are in a position where suddenly a lot of things can change. Yeah, so we don't know what kind of climate disasters will happen, and then suddenly we are in a new situation. And I think we are not well prepared, so to speak. That means even if you don't see at the moment that some changes are possible, one should be prepared in a situation where suddenly a political situation changes, and those things happen. Yeah, so we never expected something like COVID, and suddenly the world looked very different than it looked yesterday, so to speak. Yeah, and I think it makes sense to figure out policy options, institutional options, even if you don't think they are realistic at the moment. Yeah, because as academics, we should be prepared for a longer perspective, and I think it makes sense to think about these things more on a long-term perspective, even if we think at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Markus. Any more thoughts on future social ecological transformation? Henrique.
Two notes from my side. First, I'm really an optimist. Again, I gave the example of the 60s, what people thought was going to happen to the hunger. Nothing of like that happened. And across most metrics, the quality of life of people have increased around the world since that time. And so I think I'm very positive about the future, and I think that there is reasons to remain positive, but we need also to be proactive. We need to help the policies that we need to enact. But transformative change can also have its dangers, because in the past, large social engineering experiments didn't result as people intended sometimes. And I would also warn against overexcitement about transformative change in that way. The world is too complex. One of my favorite thinkers is Noam Chomsky. And he once said, the world is too complex for science. We need to discuss about values and people. And And the idea that we know exactly what to do, I think it's very dangerous. And so I think we can examine policies and consider things that we can do, but I would stay short of calling for social engineering for transformative change because of dangers that are associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Henrique. And before I hand over to Christine for a very final comment of this session, I would like to give the possibility to Yves to share your opinion on a social ecological transformation. Okay, I think Yves is frozen now.
Hello?
He's already... Yeah, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, it's working.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to flag that I believe both science and governance needs to change. On one hand, when we talk about problems such as biodiversity loss, we still work a lot on characterizing the problem, right? We keep telling people that it's a bigger problem, and we have very little, or we consider very little science on actual solutions. And transformative change and nexus are, for example, are assessments that go pathways themselves. And I hope that this will spill over also to the political processes. And there, for example, in the CBD context, when we talk about monitoring, we still have a strong bias and a strong focus on characterizing the problem and very little science on solutions. And I think that would need to change. And I think we also need to change the. I very much felt a resonance what Markus Düwell said in his talk, and I feel like this importance of contestation to find solution needs to be reflected in the way we talk about problems. And currently we talk about people and politics, and we don't talk about issues and solutions. So changing the narrative would be an important point. And the last point I would like to flag is that we say all along that biodiversity as a topic is linked to very many societal issues, but still when we approach the problem, we approach it as a sectoral problem. And Germany is advocating that it has this whole of government strategy. But in practice, the environmental ministry writes the strategy and then negotiates it with the other sectors. Like as long as we do policy making in that way, we won't find this integrated solution. We won't get a perception by many people that biodiversity is their responsibility, and we won't find solutions that are effective. Maybe that's a good way to end it. Thanks. I'm sorry for the bad connection.
Yeah, I think it was fine. Thank you very much, Yves, for staying until the end of the discussion. Yeah, and with Andre's comment or suggestion in the chat that we need an armada of micro changes, I would like to close this session, this last session of this conference. And I would like to thank all the speakers for your presentations and the participants for joining and for raising your questions. And with this, I would like to hand over to Christine for a final and concluding remarks of this session.